All right, I think we can get started. Hello and welcome everyone to this special session of the Interdisciplinary Research Seminar here at the Hong Kong Institute for the Humanities and Social Sciences. I'm Ghassan Moazid. I'm an assistant professor here at the Institute. So today is a special talk that is co-organized with the Center for China Studies at CUHK and the Faculty of Arts at CUHK. And we are very glad to welcome to the Institute Professor Joan from York University. I think I don't really need to introduce her. I think you all know her very well, but just a few words. Professor Judge is a 2021 Guggenheim Fellow, a Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada, and a professor in the Department of History at York University in Toronto. She's a cultural historian of print and knowledge in modern China and has published very widely. And I'm just going to point out what is sort of about to come out. That is her new book, The Politics of Common Reading, Vernacular Knowledge and Everyday Techniques in China, 1894 to 1954. And that's going to come out with the University of Chicago Press later this year. So we're all looking forward to that, of course. And she has published, very widely, but I don't want to take up too much time, so I'm not going to read. But I think you're all very, very familiar with her work. What Professor Judge is going to talk about today is also, I just learned from the forthcoming book. The talk is entitled Women as Vernacular Knowers in China's Long Republic, 1894 to 1954, What We Can Learn from Cheap Print. The format is as usual, so Professor Judge is first going to speak, and then we'll have some time for Q&A. So if you have any questions, then we will have the opportunity to ask them then. But I don't want to take up any more time. So Professor Judge, if you're ready, please feel free to get started.
Okay, thank you so much, Hassan. Well, thank you all for coming. So many of the knowledges that we can classify as vernacular were enacted by women. So whether it was household maintenance, the management of emergencies, or basic health care. But accessing this level of knowledge and penetrating women's experience poses significant methodological challenges. Where can we look to find vernacular knowers who did not leave physical traces of what they thought or what they did? How can we begin to reconstitute what they knew, how they knew it, and how they applied it? I attempt to overcome these methodological difficulties by using a number of proxies. I use cheap, repeatedly reprinted how-to manuals compiled by what I refer to as Indian publishers among the people publishers as proxies for vernacular knowledge. I take the step-by-step instructions inside these books for making recipes, for transforming matter, and for solving quotidian problems as proxies for vernacular techniques. And I consider the intended audience for this level of text as proxies for actual female common readers. To the extent that it is possible, I combine these proxies, what these proxies suggest, with a number of disparate other kinds of sources: contemporary observations, official documents, which I read, of course, against the grain, fait divers in newspapers, even fiction, various other kinds of materials. I also follow scholars of other parts of the world who appeal to arguments of common sense in recreating the past reading experience of untraceable common readers. So many who have tried to do this kind of research have, hit inevitably a wall because these readers haven't left tangible records. At some point, you have to use common sense to try and constitute their experience. I make contextualized imaginative beliefs. While these methods are not perfect, they are among the few that we have to access this level of knowledge and the woman who possessed it. So first of all, what do I mean by vernacular knowledge? I define vernacular knowledge as the exemplary framework for practical know-how. It is more concerned with knowledge how than with knowledge what, or with knowledge that. It guided readers, for example, in understanding the uses rather than analyzing the properties of material substances. It guided them in treating the symptoms rather than tracing the etiology of disease, of effectively cultivated rather than accurately taxonomizing plants. Despite this overriding concern with how rather than why or what, with the concrete rather than the theoretical, vernacular knowledge ultimately challenges the very hierarchy that this dichotomy implies. It helped readers investigate causal questions such as how to transform and preserve matter, how to recycle and repair various objects, and how to adjust cures. Vernacular knowledge can thus assumes a synergy between mind and hand, between what we think of as more the knowledge what and the knowledge how of the hand. It can be described as knowledge that works or materialized theory. These are some of the ways of conceptualizing it. This materialized theory was articulated in cheap print. There is no singular corpus of vernacular works that specifically targeted women. And this is in contrast to elite texts where there were specific didactic works for women. In the imperial period, and even in the more modern period, new style textbooks that specifically targeted female readers. At the same time, women are among the intended audience for many of the Mean-Gen materials that were published in what I call the Long Republic, which is the period that extends from the mid-1890s through the mid-1950s. In contrast to elite treatises, these works did not instruct women in how to enact gender through upright morality, through proper deportment, or skillful handiwork. Rather, they enabled women to perform essential practical roles by using, producing, transforming, and manipulating various objects, including food, medicine, and textiles. Most importantly for the historian, these how-to manuals, these cheap how-to books, made difficult to access implicit knowledges, including this range of household knowledges, visible. These Mean-Gen texts included household compendia. Countless publishers announced in the titles, subtitles, and prefaces to their collections that they were for household use. The use of their term for the household, one that we're all very familiar with now, the jiating, presaged a shift at this time from the late Qing in the conception of women's roles. So the term jiating itself signaled what was a new social formation, not the extended three-generational arrangement common through the late imperial period, but the new nuclear household that was implicitly a site of reform linked to the broader national household, or the guojia. And while this term was gender neutral and the space was not explicitly feminine, it denoted a sphere within which women were no longer cloistered in the inner chambers, but actively present in all household activities. The Mean-Gen works that addressed this space offered common readers household knowledge, advice on household medicine. They included collections of techniques which would have been of use and of interest to both men and women in the household. And this is one example that I'll refer to a number of times. This was one of the more prominent of the collections of techniques. And you can see that it was subtitled A Precious Year for the Family. It included sections on cooking, on clothing, pediatrics, emergencies, accidents, women's adornments, and female reproductive health. These vernacular household texts also included a number of works that were focused on the everyday. There's a number of examples on the screen, and other works that had been compiled and produced from the late imperial period, including the Wanbao Chuan Shu, Complete Compendium of Myriad Treasures, and Myriad Matters About Which You Won't Need to Ask. The contours of this female readership that used these texts created for the household and for learning new techniques is difficult to fit into the broader literacy landscape in China. So these kinds of readers elude us. And to give you a sense of how I define common readers, I define them as readers who read books not for a living, but in order to make a living. So less for leisure and pleasure than in order to help them achieve what they needed to in their daily lives. Quantifications of literacy in China in this period are problematic in terms of definition, in terms of metrics, and geographic scope. We are all familiar with Evelyn Rowski's widely cited national literacy figures of 2 to 10% literacy for females, 35 to 40% for males in the 18th and 19th centuries. And this has been used as a baseline for many later assessments. Different regional or demographic surveys have yielded higher, if still relatively low numbers. A province-wide customs report from Jiangsu, which was one of the more developed provinces from 1912 to 21, deemed 10 to 30% of women literate in the period 1912 to 21. A survey undertaken at a Shanghai silk-making factory shortly before 1928, in contrast, found that only 15% of female workers versus 40% of males could read their surnames, and only 3% could write them. In the same period, out of the 245 individuals found to be literate among 100 families of postal workers, only 34 out of 422, or 14%, illiterate were women. These numbers suggest that as opportunities for formal female education expanded from the early 20th century, rates of female literacy rose, but not dramatically. The first private schools for Chinese girls were established from the late 1890s, and the Qing government actually sanctioned education for girls in 1907. The various fledgling Republican governments continued to support the growth of women's middle and higher education from 1912. According to admittedly problematic statistics, female enrollment in the new government schools was minimal. Female students allegedly constituted a mere 0.7% of the total number of students in official schools in 1906, the year before the government officially sanctioned public education for girls. By 1923, some 16 years later, this number rose to just a little over 6%. Of China's 1,843 counties in 1923, 72% had no girls studying above the lower elementary level, and 31% had no female enrollment in elementary schools at all. Such enrollment figures and literacy statistics were something of an obsession for Chinese officials and reformers from the turn of the 20th century. Everybody was trying to exactly capture how many individuals could read. Part of the reason was they accepted the literacy myth, which identified literacy as the key component to economic development, democratic practice, and upward social mobility. They added China's putatively abysmal national literacy rates to the list of its avowed deficiencies vis-a-vis foreign countries. And this obsession that individuals held, reformers and officials held at the time in trying to, place China globally, is an obsession that many scholars have shared as they have sifted through the disparate data and debated the question of just how many Chinese read. But here, after I've flooded you with all of these numbers, I propose that we take a different tack, that we work backwards from the vestiges of practices towards a historical understanding of female common readers as knowers rather than as numbers. This vernacular literacy approach questions how written text, and we have many written texts, how they fit into the practices of people's lives rather than the other way around. It reveals that commoner literacy was often acquired informally, attained unevenly, and developed incrementally. It was also applied circumstantially. It was dependent on and nurtured by what I have identified as a Minjian knowledge infrastructure. So this was a shadow informal infrastructure that addressed the needs of commoners that were not met by the insufficient state infrastructure, whether in the realms of education, of public health, or of social security. So this alternate infrastructure included the Minjian publishers, which I've already briefly introduced, and a national book network, which got these books from where they were produced in Shanghai to all corners of the country. It consisted of independent schools and of street-side bookstalls, both of which I will go into more detail in a moment. So this infrastructure offered alternatives to the often inhospitable government school system and the elite initiatives and official social programs that were designed to produce politically compliant model readers. While these model readers were to be made, this was a state project, this was an elite project, these model readers were to be molded in a particular way. Common readers, including the female common readers we're talking about today, essentially made themselves. These largely self-made common readers lived in metropolitan centers, in provincial towns, and rural villages. A critical mass were clustered in rural urban communities on the outskirts of major cities. They often began their education in the independent schools, the Soshu. And I am translating this as independent schools to underscore, on the one hand, that the students were quite independent. They learned at their own pace, not at a class. They weren't, shepherded through at the same level as other classmates, and also that they were independently set up and often funded, so independent from the modern government-run school system. These independent schools emerged out of local communities rather than by government fiat, established, as I suggested, by individual teachers or by households or communities. They flourished through the early 1950s despite decades of central and local government campaigns to either eliminate them or reform them. These campaigns did force many of the schools to operate clandestinely, making it difficult to estimate their precise number. Disparate evidence in educational reports, local gazetteers, Republican period surveys, and communist records nonetheless reveal something of the magnitude of these schools and suggest they may have enrolled as many, and in some areas up to 3 times the number of students that were enrolled in the official government schools. So a mass that has not been, well captured by any statistics, but that was clearly there. The volume of independent schools remained high through the 1940s as villagers turned to them in increasing numbers in wartime. They served as a model for communist mass educators in the early 1920s, and as a prototype for the communist people's schools, the Minban Shueshao, from the 1930s through the early 1950s. Most importantly for our topic today, relatively high numbers of female students enrolled in the independent schools. It's been documented that families were generally more willing to send their daughters to these independent schools, these local community-run schools, than to the new style schools. And that the number of girls studying in independent schools was particularly high in remote rural areas. A key reason for this relatively high female enrollment was because the schools were more attuned to local customs, including local gender norms. They were in sync with the rhythm of local labor and village life. But this is not to say that they were static, unchanging institutions. The independent schools evolved over the course of a period, both in response to government efforts to reform them, and also just in response to what was going on the ground, the shifting practical demands of local life. Independent schools in the Chengdu region adjusted their offerings in the context of the Second World War, for example. As war conditions necessitated greater female involvement both inside and outside the home from 1940, the demand for literate housewives increased. Schools in the area, the independent schools, then began to expand their offerings for female education. The enrollment of comparatively older girls aged 14 to 16 grew in significant numbers. In one of the 14 districts of Chengdu Shen, for example, there were 102 girls among 720 students, so about 14% of the student body. And, this is versus like the 6% we talked about in the early 1920s in the modern schools. Not all of these girls would exclusively become housewives. Independent schools, and particularly reformed independent schools, were also female students' prime gateway to middle school and the possibility of some kind of a career. Another key institution in the Minjian knowledge infrastructure was the street-side bookstall. Female common readers nurtured their learning alongside male common readers at neighborhood bookstalls rather than in official reading rooms set up by government officials or local elites. A 1933 survey of bookstalls in Shanghai challenged assumptions that ordinary women were not readers. The author of the survey, and he was a library reformer who studied the bookstalls in order to, again, be part of this project of reforming common readers. So he wanted a better sense of what they were actually reading. He was a man by the name of Xu Shu, declared that one of the most important findings of his 1933 survey of Shanghai bookstalls was that women in the city, particularly those around age 21, rented books in great numbers. They included housewives who others claimed would not have had the time to pick up a book. They included, they included prostitutes, bookstall surveys in other parts of the country. So his survey is the richest that we have, but others were conducted elsewhere. One in Kaifeng, for example, also recorded the engagement of female customers. These included maidservants who may have been acquiring books for themselves, may have been acquiring them for their female employers, and again, prostitutes. An extensive national network took Minjian books beyond urban bookstalls to communities far from these major urban centers. Common readers could purchase recipe formularies at branch bookstores in many parts of the country. They could consult household compendia at village bookstalls and mail order letter writing guides from Minjian book catalogs. A fleet of traveling book merchants and itinerant peddlers, together with an increasingly dense grid of transport and postal routes, kept books flowing from the warehouses of Minjian publishers in Shanghai to these readers in the distant hinterland and to all points in between. Some rural women were reluctant to visit institutions outside of the home to borrow books. They were, however, avid consumers of the books that these peddlers would bring to their homes or that itinerant libraries would circulate from one household to another on a monthly or bi-monthly basis. When porters carried books house to house in a 1.5 mile radius around Beibeishi, formerly a district around Chongqing in the mid-1930s, women willingly took books and started reading. Communists also found that young and middle-aged women showed a strong interest in literacy acquisition in northern Shanxi in the 1940s. Disparate anecdotes offer glimpses of who these eager female readers may have been and what the conditions and strategies were for their self-making. A woman from Baoding, a prefectural level city in Hebei province, made herself as a common reader through what we could think of as male adjacent reading. She first taught herself basic literacy using the calligraphy copybooks and primers that her brothers had discarded after using them at an independent school. She continued to study grammar and vocabulary herself by reading books that interested her, including Holoma. She went on to learn what we can think of as woman learning on the job, mastering the abacus, studying arithmetic after she married in order to keep household accounts. She deepened her reading skills as she supervised her son's education, memorizing the same 3,000 characters that she chose for him to learn from a primer on the 13 classics. So again, male adjacent reading. She continued to study alongside him when he was an elementary student and to learn as she became a teacher herself. She first established a training school for caregivers in 1907, then an elementary school for girls, and finally in the 1920s, she managed the Northern Metropolitan Factory for Poor Female Workers in Beijing. A female worker at a factory that manufactured needles for a Western sock company in Hunan similarly beat the literacy odds in the mid-republic. Despite the limited primary education she had received at an independent school and the long hours of labor that she endured, together with the vast disparities between female literacy and male literacy, to say nothing of the disparities in salaries, she managed to devote all of her spare time, evenings when she worked the day shift, part of her days when she worked the night shift, and all day Sunday to reading. Similar to the female factory manager from Baoding, she benefited from male adjacent learning. Her younger male cousin passed the books he had read on to her. And while the 6-day work week was exhausting, the time when she was not on the factory floor was her own. If she had been at home, either as a daughter or a wife, her off hours would have been consumed by various domestic chores. This was the key reason, or one of the key reasons, for the stagnation of female learning. While male workers would make time for recreation even after 12-hour shifts, female workers who lived at home would be expected to catch up on housework after leaving the factory floor. In the factory dormitory, the young woman from Hunan was, however, free to read. Because of the freedom reading afforded her, her work life, in her own words, was bliss. While women did work as factory laborers, even as factory managers, as we've seen from the previous example, and as educators, the most common primary occupation for women in the Long Republic continued to be that of housewife. Just as their male counterparts would have had to continue developing their literacy skills on the job, whether they were reading animal husbandry manuals as farmers, whether they were managing correspondence as shop clerks, or parsing addresses as postal couriers, women were faced with often unrecognized literacy demands as household managers. These demands required that they engage in household science. I use an assemblage of methods to attempt to reconstruct how and why women engaged in household science. In creating these composites of these women household scientists, if you will, I draw on archives of practice, the step-by-step instructions in household manuals, so those Mindian how-to books, in recipe collections, in other materials of this kind, which common readers might have used to solve specific problems. I combine an external history of reading, which pays attention to the who, the why, the what, and the where of reading, with a close internal reading of a range of primary documents, from the how-to texts themselves to contemporary publishing histories, from Fady Bear in newspapers to journal reports, fiction, and archival documents. Ultimately, I blend these three elements in creating these composites of female readers. The first element is authentic names, actual locations, and the details of once pressing problems. The second is deeply contextualized common sense. The third is an imaginative engagement with this culturally manifold moment, its richly heterogeneous sources, and its gallery of elusive female readers. So I will give you a few examples. For the third time in less than 2 months, Mrs. Lee's husband had come home with the wrong clothing. He was a clothing merchant of all ironies, and when he traveled to Shanghai from their native village near Taixing in Jiangsu province, he usually stayed for at least a week so he could visit all of his dealers. This meant that particularly in the hot summer months, he had to take his light jackets and even sometimes his gowns to a laundress in the city. This time he came back with the wrong jacket, one that was threadbare and a distasteful brown color. Mrs. Lee was determined to label his clothing from now on, something she knew other wives of traveling merchants did. She turned to the section on clothing and shoes, cotton and silk in the ocean of secret techniques, the Nishuhai, one of these texts that I introduced earlier, where she found an entry on methods for indelibly stamping characters on clothing. It included 3 techniques. 2 of these methods had already appeared in a supplement to the Wanbao Chuan Shu since 1906. Slightly revised versions of these techniques would continue to be reported in daily use collections over the following decades. Unmarked clothing was clearly an issue that acquired attention. The first method recommended in the ocean of secret techniques required heating a piece of rusted iron until it was red hot, dipping it in black vinegar several times, and using the vinegar to imprint characters on the garment. Imprinted in this way, the text declared the characters would never come out in the wash. The second technique used lead type. A later version suggested even purchasing the type from a printer, which, similar to the rusted iron, had to be heated until it was almost red hot. Then it would be forcibly pressed down onto white sugar that was spread in the area where it was to be imprinted. This imprint would also survive repeated washing. The third method involved first stamping a corner of the lower hem of the garment and stamping it with red paste. The stamp would not last for more than half a year. Based on effectiveness and availability of materials, Mrs. Lee opted for the first method. She submerged a rusty nail, which she found in the neighborhood, in vinegar, which she had in her pantry, to make the indelible iron acetate dye. Wang Shigen was an egg peddler with high aspirations. He had convinced his wife, Wang Guilan, to leave their native Ningbo so he could set up a business in Shanghai. They now lived on the outskirts of the city where they continued to raise chickens and ducks. 3 times a week, he sold their fresh eggs on Food Market Street at the Taiping Bridge in the French concession. Wang now wanted to expand his business. With 10 eggs selling for the going rate of 20 jiao in Shanghai at this time, he could make a good profit. If he had a way of storing eggs, he could produce more and branch out to other markets while still having enough for the family. Ideally, he would store the eggs in a dedicated cold storage unit, but such units would be complicated and expensive to set up and maintain. Weilan knew that there were other simpler, practical, and effective methods of safely preserving eggs, so she started to do her own research. She had vague recollections of methods acquaintances of her mother had used to preserve eggs. If they were still in Ningbo, she could have asked friends or aunts, someone who would have taught her what she needed to know. Fortunately, cheap books that passed on the kinds of information women had always shared were widely available in Shanghai. Weilan was just literate enough to use the finding mechanisms to locate the entries she might need in a text, and her husband could always help her to read them if necessary. So she turned to the daily use encyclopedia for citizens. She scanned the table of contents until she located a section on drink and food. This included a subsection on storing food and an entry on storing fresh eggs. The same technique had been printed in the Myriad Treasure supplement from 1906, and it had been reprinted from a Catholic missionary-inspired digest that was published in Chinese in 1904. And that itself had probably drawn on one of a number of Western cookbooks in which this method of preserving eggs had circulated from the 1800s. Versions of this particular method would become the most widely reprinted egg preservation technique in Chinese daily use compilations and in periodicals, both periodicals that targeted worldly housewives, so this is from Ling No, or periodicals that actually targeted subliterate rural women. Where was stuff? Joan hardly needed her husband's help in reading the simple instructions in the encyclopedia for citizens. She followed them to the letter. She first purchased approximately 2 pounds of quicklime at her local Western pharmacy and mixed it thoroughly with clear water in a small jar. She then tightly closed the jar and left it overnight. The next day, she spread the lime mixture all over a dozen of their prize hen's fresh eggs. She gingerly placed them in a larger earthenware jar, similar to the one that appeared in this periodical, which she sealed tightly so that no air could get in. Then she waited to see if the experiment had worked. According to the Daily Use Encyclopedia, the eggs would remain fresh and tasty as this first day for several months. Joan and generations of others who followed this simple recipe were engaged in household science. The combination of quicklime, calcium oxide, and water that they smeared on the eggs yielded an inorganic compound, calcium hydroxide, which prevented oxidization and kept the eggs fresh. Their practices of preserving other foodstuffs, including rice and wheat, fruit and vegetables, fish and meats, similarly deepened their grasp of local natural knowledge. Over time, household methods featured in later compendia, so compendia that were published as late as the 1940s, further introduced new substances such as linseed oil and Vaseline, which could be spread on the eggs. The Vaseline could be spread around the pot, holding the preserved eggs in order to stop evaporation. Several of these methods, including the quicklime and the Vaseline methods, would continue to circulate on the internet as late as our own day and be touted as both cost-effective and ultra-effective. Zhou Ling, a blacksmith in Hangzhou, fell ill with cholera. When he returned home early that day, his wife was shocked, given all the health precautions they had taken. Most who came down with cholera belonged to what she considered to be a class below theirs, coolies, not craftsmen like her husband. According to an investigation of 558 cases in Hangzhou that very year, 1946, some 37% of cholera victims were members of this lower class. 37% were servants or household workers. Only 17% were engaged in commerce, the closest demographic to her husband's. This 1946 Hangzhou survey did not capture women as a separate category, nor did it account for housewives, who often went uncounted as cholera victims. Surveys that did include housewives indicated that they were among the most affected. According to a tabulation of cholera patients conducted at the Fengling Bridge Temporary Epidemic Hospital in Shanghai that same year, 1946, housewives represented a higher number of patients than workers, including factory workers, workshop pullers, dock workers, street cleaners, and garbage collectors. The general perception was, however, this particular survey was unusual in that it pinpointed the case of women. The general perception was that men were more likely than women to fall victim to the disease, and several studies supported that view. The common explanation for this gender imbalance was that women who rarely ate outside of the home had less exposure to infection. In reality, however, women were potentially more exposed to the disease because of their caregiving responsibilities within the home. The vast majority did not have the option of sending sick family members to hospitals or to infectious disease institutes. There were only 6 such institutes in all of China at this time in the 1940s. Women may not have dropped dead in the street, but they suffered behind closed doors with a lag of hours or days after the men who they cared for. Mrs. Joe had been brought up to understand that once she was married, she would be on the front lines of the battle against contagious illness in the home. Her 3-pronged domestic defense against contagion consisted of disinfectant, of preventatives, and of effective remedies. Her mother had used simple methods to purify the household when anyone fell ill. She would burn anything disposable that the patient had touched. She would boil the patient's soiled clothing and leave other things out to dry in the sun until it was no longer contaminated. But Mrs. Joe used new, more scientific methods. Following the advice in 2 of her long-standing household Bibles, Myriad Matters About Which You Don't Need to Ask, and Everyday Life at a Glance, she always kept a stock of crystallized carbolic acid in the house. Since Joleon's apprenticeship had ended and his employment was secured, she had the means to purchase it at the local Western pharmacy without a second thought. By the time she had her own family to take care of in the 1930s, carbolic acid, which had been used from the late 19th century in antiseptic surgery in the West and in cholera prevention in Japan, from the Meiji period, had become a staple in China as well. As soon as Jolene returned home ill, she started to prepare carbolic water, following the instructions in the Myriad Matters. She mixed the equivalent of 1.8 grams of the crystallized carbolic acid, 0.37 grams of hydraulic acid, and 35 grams water until the carbolic acid was dissolved. She then followed the instructions in Everyday Life at a Glance. She washed all of her husband's bedding and clothing twice over 24 hours and disinfected the room, the floors, the bed, anything he had touched. She kept a supply of milk of lime on hand as well. Interchangeable with quicklime, she used it to clean the latrine. Some also recommended using it to disinfect soiled objects. She was aware of yet another disinfectant that she had not yet tried, ferrous sulfate, recommended in another everyday compendia. Clearly, at this point in time, there was too much for the everyday housewife to know. As she stirred the disinfectant solution, she fortified herself with camphor wine. So this was a preventative, an internationally recognized common cholera remedy that was featured in Chinese home medical texts through the early 1950s. Although it was possible to purchase camphor wine at the local Western pharmacy, she preferred to make it herself. She would put several drops of a mixture of 1 bottle of aged brandy and 15 grams of clean white camphor in a small cup and add a little boiled water. Alternate recipes used some other form of alcohol in place of the brandy and included field leaf oil. What her husband needed at this point was not a preventative, however, but medicine for the acute stage of the illness. She chose a recipe that appeared twice under Methods for Treating Contagious Illnesses and under Simple Western Recipes in the Encyclopedia for Daily Life, which she had recently received by mail order. The key ingredient was calomel or mercurius chloride, a mineral with a long and increasingly contested medical history in the West. The recipe was simple: 0.5 grams calomel, 0.5 grams lactose, both of which she purchased at the Western pharmacy. She tripled it as a treatment which could be repeated 3 times, required 1 packet every 3 hours. After the second round, Jolene's cramping, pain, and rice-like diarrhea and vomiting had subsided. He was starting to recover. Mrs. Joe then shifted to a therapy featured in the same encyclopedia for what she hoped would be the recovering phase of his illness. She would give him 1 of 10 packets of a mixture of opium dregs, bismuth subnitrate, and white sugar every hour. She had just given him the 5th packet when she felt a sudden attack of symptoms. She had followed countless women who fell ill between several hours and a couple of days after they began caring for infected husbands, father-in-laws, or stepfathers. Her mother-in-law now took over. Such was the chain of the caregiving burden in the Joe family. As these 3 examples and countless others indicate, cheap how-to books textualized material practices by offering step-by-step instructions for assembling, mixing, and administering medical cures, for labeling, preserving, transforming, and repairing objects. The vernacular knowledge rendered in these materials is just the tip of an epistemic iceberg of techniques that were passed on orally and generationally. These recorded and unreported techniques contributed to the making of gender, the formation of the adept caregiver, the competent homemaker, the frugal housewife, and the accomplished midwife. The how-to manuals promoted practical virtues that were embodied through the mastery of these everyday technologies, rather than through acts of fidelity or proper comportment. They required women to use their hands to produce tangible, mundane things, rather than more rarefied objects such as embroidered shoes or elegant cloud collars. The process of acquiring and enacting these forms of vernacular knowing further revealed the importance of an informal knowledge infrastructure and Minjian sites of knowledge production and dissemination. These include the quasi-transgressive site of the street side bookstall, where women could publicly seek knowledge or diversion. But they also include the least transgressive of sites, the household, the key space for enacting gender, not just for cloistered elite women, but for commoner housewives and working women. These commoner women engaged in various forms of household science, household alchemy, and household health maintenance. In learning to transform objects in the service of their families, they gained a deeper understanding of natural substances, of newly imported chemicals. At the same time, they also learned about renewed, innovative ways of enacting womanhood in a changeling world. These women also became what we could think of as autonomous vernacular knowers, who were not dependent on state-sanctioned instruction, nor were they dependent on the tutelage of elites. Rather, they were dependent on a more implicit politics of accommodation, the topic of the book that this paper comes out of. Thank you very much for your attention. Rubo.
Okay, so first of all, thank you so much, Joan, for the wonderful talk. I think we're all looking forward to the book now. Of course, we'll be keen to read it. As I said, we have some time for questions now, so I'd be happy to open up the floor. Do we have any questions? All right, please here. Yeah.
I have a question for Professor Judge. Thank you for your insightful talk. I'm curious about what do the girls in dependent school learn? It reminds me of the story written by Lu Xun, 在酒楼上, when the narrator I talked to Liu Weifu said, currently I abandoned the new knowledge. I just teach in the girls' school. They taught 女四书, for books for female readers. So I'm curious about that part. What do you find what do you find the girls learning and what do they learn in the independent schools? Another question is that you indicated the transcultural dimensions of those encyclopedia or compendium. Do you have any other? Do you have something more to say about this part? Whether the translated or adapted, the Japanese sources or some English sources? Thank you.
Excellent, thank you. The prime thing I believe that this is on, yeah. Young women learned in the independent schools, which is the basic literacy. So these schools used, the traditional primers, and they were able to build their reading skills to the point of enabling them to read things beyond these very basic texts. So they weren't learning so much specific subjects as they were learning, foundational literacy skills. And they were also not, learning things directly related to the household. So that would sort of come after, but these were the basic building blocks. The question about transcultural knowledge, the vernacular knowledge that appeared in these how-to texts can be thought of as sort of a merging or assemblage of three different kinds of knowledge. So long existing knowledge in China itself that came out of, traditional treatises, knowledge that came, as you've suggested, from the outside world. So this included translated knowledge on, various aspects of science, et cetera, that would have been taken up by the editors either from newspapers that included, for example, there were, many articles about cholera and cholera cures, or for similar kinds of how-to books published elsewhere, generally in Japan. And then the third element was the experience of the compilers themselves. So these were the three elements that they brought together. So definitely an important transcultural dimension. But what's different about these texts is that this knowledge was not sort of identified as, the key source of knowledge. It was merged with these other forms of knowledge in cases when it could really serve the direct practical needs of the individuals that would use the how-to books. So there was less sort of theorization about science or even discussion of science as a concept. But at the same time, there was this, sort of distilling of the more practical aspects of knowledge. So, these compilers might take a relatively complex scientific treatise, whether it was on, diseases or plants, and distill what was, just the most practical kind of knowledge that this level of reader would. So yes, transcultural knowledge, but knowledge that's been sort of distilled and simplified.
Yeah, thank you for your fascinating talk. I have two questions. The first is about the marketing network. Actually, it relates to what I like your book cover a lot. Is the distribution of the knowledge, right? The Yaofa. And I'm just curious about women's role in the marketing, production, distribution of the knowledge. So, or actually, those knowledge is still like in the production or the distribution system still dominated by men. This is my first question. The second question will be so because of the knowledge per se is changed because of the uninstitutionalized aspect of the usage. So I'm just wondering, so is it after the Republic era where we talk about the revolutionary era, is the state intervened to institutionalize all those knowledges, to degeneralize that? Because all the vignettes you share, it reminds me of the textbook in the communist era to teach the mass how they make medical cures at home, how to preserve the eggs for the revolutionary development. So yeah, I want to hear about your insights about the historical development of this perspective. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Jacqueline. So the network was really incredibly well developed, this network for getting these books out of the cities into the countryside. And you have intellectuals in the 1930s discovering this and just they can't fathom it because they've got, obviously their own networks, they use the post office, et cetera. But there were these more informal networks where the Minjian publishers would have, contacts in, provincial, center. And there would be sort of this, gradually get deeper and deeper into the countryside. So they would have relations with a merchant in a provincial capital. The provincial capital would, take one set of books, sell a number of them in their own capital, but then also sell further to those who were deeper in the hinterland. And, this went all the way to, really quite far to remote parts of the country. These texts also reached remote reaches of the country through a mail order system. So even these Minjian publishers had a mail order abilities that were significantly cheaper than the post office, and that again reached these readers that the elites were completely unaware that there was this parallel network. Whether or not women were involved in the network itself, I don't think so. These were book merchants and book peddlers. So it was the men who were doing the moving of the books. The women were not involved in that aspect of it. And your second question, if I've answered that one well enough, about how this knowledge relates to knowledge when we get into the communist era, I go into that in the conclusion, and I think we've got a lot more to learn about this, but I think a tremendous amount that was in these vernacular texts in the Republic was appropriated into some of these texts that were then labeled mass science, quite often unidentified, and with no sort of, not claiming that they're directly taken from these Republican texts. And then, very interestingly, a number of these texts start to get reprinted in the 1980s and 1990s. So there's an ongoing space for this vernacular knowledge. It gets labeled differently. Under the communists, it gets labeled as mass, it gets labeled as science. But quite often it's the same knowledge and it draws on a lot of the same materials. So there is definitely, and I have one really interesting anecdote that I actually start the conclusion with, where a man who is accused, he had been accused of being a rightist in the late 1950s, but during the Cultural Revolution, his house is raided by Red Guards. And he still has a copy of the Mishuhai, that Ocean of Secret Techniques text that I talked about a number of times. And the Red Guards think that it's a nefarious, dangerous text because it's got me in the title. And so they take it, and in his memoirs, he says, this is just a simple book that the Minjian used to make things and fix things and cure illnesses. So it's this very interesting, sort of the people, confiscating the people's knowledge and saying that this is, so, the ways that this knowledge sort of gets reused and but if it's not properly labeled, it can't be reused in the PRC period is really, really interesting.
Professor Judge, thank you for the fascinating talk. My own research recently about mass literacy, female literacy, but from a religious perspective, because I work on history of Christianity in China. I've collected and studied letters written by Chinese Christian women, Catholic women, to their foreign missionaries. Anyway, so part of the research is very relevant to my current research, and I'm very interested in that. I have two questions, one specific and a specific question, and second one is more theoretical. The first question is about the cover photo of the presentation. It's fascinating. So the women holding a baby and reading books in the street bookstores. So that sounds very familiar. I'm from Chongqing. Even in 1980s, we still have those street bookstores in Chongqing, but mostly those books are what we call 小人书 or 连环画. So it's basically like pictures. So I'm very curious, the picture.
what the women is reading is that 连环画. So that means thinking of literacy level. So that's different. So second question, I'm from your own research and this book, I'm wondering whether you have some reflections about the current study of mass literacy in China, because after Roski's book, published in 1979, 40 years later, we didn't see any significant study in terms of mass literacy in China. And also maybe the criteria in defining literacy, mass literacy in Roski's studies is what we can call the elite literacy based on the Keji system, the ability to read and write in classic books, texts, and Chinese. So if we take these like account books, like the Yao Fang or all these vernacular literacy into consideration, so maybe we can redefine. So some scholars and myself, we think there is another term we can use, like functional literacy, so that we can include all these female or lower class literacy functioning in everyday life. So I'm very curious, what's your insights from your research on this, redefining mass literacy?
Thank you. So the first question about, the Lian Huanhua. So many observations about bookstalls or descriptions of bookstalls claim that all they had were Lian Huanhua, that all they had were these sort of very easy to read and low level, often racy, even pornographic, real garbage sort of literature. And I think that's a total misrepresentation. It's not until the late 1920s that Lian Huanhua actually take off and become the centerpiece of the bookstalls. Bookstalls had been, part of the urban landscape for probably at least decades and possibly centuries before that. So one of the ways I could get a sense that other things were sold at the bookstalls was through these social surveys that were done in the 1930s, which are an absolutely incredible source. And, as I said in the talk, the objective for the surveys was to reform the people who were reading there, but they nonetheless documented the kinds of works that were available. And particularly the Kaifeng survey was incredibly rich. And it said that, there are these different kinds of bookstalls. There are those that just have the illustrated serial books, but there are also those that have, the general knowledge and those that have more fiction. But there was a tremendous amount of daily use knowledge that was sold at these bookstalls. And I've got many disparate sources I've drawn on, including photographs. One of the photographs of the man standing, I can pull it up again, but I actually tried to read, and I could read the titles of many of the books and their letter writing manuals and their Yao Fang. And so, yes, those kinds of books, the fiction, the low-level fiction was sold at the bookstalls, but so were many other kinds of materials. And another survey that sort of helps us get a sense of this was done in the early 1950s. And we have this in like the Shanghai Municipal Archives, when the government again wanted to know about the bookstalls in order to reform them. So they did, very, very fine-grained surveys, and they found that there was one genre of bookstall that they called new book bookstalls, and they sold this kind of how-to material that was extremely useful. So I've got a lot of disparate sources that have pointed me to sort of more depth to the bookstalls than just the illustrated serial books. Your second question, mass literacy and moving away from it. So that was one of the things that drove me at the beginning of this project, because, I've always been very interested, obviously, in print and reading and trying to get a sense of, how we can, really think about how many readers they were, what they were reading, how they were reading. So I put a tremendous amount of thought into that in this project, and ultimately moved towards this notion of vernacular literacy that I presented today. We have all kinds of numbers. They're disparate. They're almost senseless. They count different things. Like some of them, you can read a newspaper, that counts as literacy. Others, it's You can write your name. So I ultimately said, I'm giving up on the metrics. I'm not going to try and find a number. I'm not going to play. And that's why I said I tried to go from numbers to knowers and to go backwards. We've got a lot of these books. Somebody was reading them. Somebody was using them. And then trying to, determine who would have used them and why. And I think, what you mentioned is functional literacy is one of the ways we have to think about it, that there were different literacies. There were commercial literacies, there were household literacies, and people learned a particular vocabulary that could help them do what they needed to do. So it was different from a more generalized literacy, but it was a literacy that helped them achieve, what they needed to achieve in their lives. So yes, I agree completely. We have to move away from these sort of blanket notions of literacy and try and get a sense of how reading was a technology that, helped these people in daily life. And, it wasn't contemplative, it was consultative, it was fragmented, but it was nonetheless a form of reading. So I'd love to learn more about your research. We can talk later.
For this fascinating talk in the project. I'm not a historian. I'm just I wouldn't dare. But I'm very curious because I know you're talking about reading and text and sort of vernacular knowledge coming from that. But as an anthropologist, I'm always very curious about the audio aspect. So can we think about the passing or the generational passing of vernacular knowledge through listening, chanting, singing, and all the ritual aspects? I know Li Ji was talking about the missionaries and all that. So in church services, in Taoist services, Buddhist services, all of that, there's a very, very strong audio aspect of literacy too. And I just wonder whether there's, I'm sure you must have sort of investigated that too, but I can see some beautiful interdisciplinary collaboration and mutual enrichment of historians and anthropologists, exploring, as you are indicating, these multiple channels of various forms of literacy. Beyond, obviously, you're talking about literacy and knowledge beyond the formal institutions of knowledge and education. But if we can go even further to explore those channels that historians might not have looked at. I'm just curious.
Excellent point. And, one really good example is in the Wanbao Chuanshu, the section on pregnancy. So you've got multiple registers in one text. You've got the image of the fetus, supposedly over 10 months. You've got poems, which would have been chanted and that would describe that particular stage of literacy. So whether that was for the midwife to sort of memorize and then sort of know what to look for at each stage, whether it was for the mother who might not have been literate to at least, learn the poem that could help her understand what was going on in her body. That was combined with, so you've got the images, you've got the poems, then you've got an explanation of the poems, maybe for those who really want to understand, what exactly might have been going on beyond, sort of this poetic kind of explanation. And then you've got recipes for what the pregnant woman might be feeling at that particular month. So I think that's a beautiful example of, the many, so somebody completely illiterate could have gotten something out of the images, subliterate, or even the illiterates also could have, heard through the mnemonics of hearing the poem would have, grasped some of the knowledge. And so, these texts did have to try and hit at different registers. In the more, I try to sort of trace a process. I think these texts become more what I call secularized and sort of scientized over time, even though they don't use the term science, they try to avoid that. But like the Ocean of Secret Techniques, which was first written in 1915, is really quite fanciful and imaginative. And the same techniques would be produced in later texts, but with sort of shorn of the more fanciful detail, like, this was written on a stele in Sichuan and, in the ancient past. So that is sort of a process that moves away from the more auditory and the more fanciful. But there's still a place for that. That figures particularly in the earlier materials. But it would be wonderful to know more about sound. And, obviously so much of this knowledge was passed on orally before it was textualized.
I really like the idea of separating literacy from knowledge. And the long tradition of women being knowers, people know what to do, and people actually do them, right? I think this is really important, that the women were in any household expected to be the ones who do certain things, like taking care of the sick, right? So when we talk about taking care of the sick, we have an idea of administering medicine, for instance. But in the old days, the women actually made the medicine.
Yes.
They actually prepared the recipes. They knew where to get the different herbs. We have these stories about women getting poisoned, and the maid would be the one going out to get the poison. All these stories that you read. The maids were all the ones who did all the, somebody wants to sell an earring or something, the maid would be doing it. They knew how to, do things, where to get things done. And I think most of them were illiterate, of course, right? So our idea of literacy is very formalized and very constrained. And when I was growing up, my nanny wasn't one of these women who would not marry, but she said she was illiterate. She didn't know how to write, but she could read all the street signs and the shop names. And I learned a lot of my Chinese from her when I was a little girl, and she knew all the household accounts. She was buying and selling shares, buying properties and things when she got a little older. So they were very good at absorbing knowledge from observation, from doing.
Yeah.
And I think the doing was really important.
Absolutely.
And among prostitutes, for instance, in the pre-modern period, they knew what to do with a certain, if they had syphilis, they knew how to take care of it, or the brothel keepers would know how to take care of the women. So certain kinds of knowledge were really important and practical for certain types of women. And I think the fact that servants did so much is really important.
Absolutely.
Fascinating topic and waiting for the book. Two somewhat related questions, I think. We're talking about how to. How to means to go from A to B. You need to understand that the situation needs to be addressed, and then there's a certain desired outcome. For the period in flux that you're talking about, the people have a good repertoire of problems to solve, and do they know what the desired outcomes were supposed to be? Do you feel that the situations that you see in the manuals are basically a standard repertoire of situations that needed to be attended to, or were there some of the newer things that people were not even aware of, and this is a problem, you can actually do something about it if you do it right? Then the desired outcome after 3 days is that this will happen. I wonder how much of that is all new, how much of that is what say Elizabeth and Helen were talking about, more of transcribing something into more of a textual form. And the second question, which I think is somewhat related, is you're talking about vernacular knowledge. I think it's more than vernacular. You said that they try to avoid the term science. But what you're talking about is very secular as well, right? Was there anything in the manuals that would tell you how to sanctify a certain place, for which there is really no standard measurement of efficacy? Is there a certain section on how to hang up a portrait of Chairman Mao? Something like that. Is that a certain how-to mindset for that, or is that a separate genre of how-to manuals? Thank you.
Okay, so the first one, was about, first question, remind me? Yeah, yes, excellent. So I had to focus on certain problems in order to, sort of give this a certain amount of depth. So I chose 4 problems that recurred in these materials. One of them was how to cure an opium addiction. So this appeared from 1906 in a supplement to the Wanbao Chuan Shu. It actually drew on a recipe that Lin Zixu had first formulated, in the 19th century. But it was clearly a problem that was considered urgent and ongoing because it appears over and over in these texts. So that's, clearly the outcome is we want this person to get off of opium. And really interesting, like the substitution method, which was really quite, sophisticated. It's used to this day. So that was one kind of problem. Another, as you suggest, some of them were new things. So from the ocean of secret techniques, I picked up on the one about how to treat an electric shock, because electricity was just coming in, and the author had actually worked at the Jiangnan Arsenal, at quite a low level, and that in itself is really interesting. Like there's all these people who are these low-level workers at these kinds of places, so he knew a bit about electricity. And, he said, I know mostly about big machines, but people aren't concerned with that in the home. So he just tried to introduce mostly the dangers of electricity. His main concern was that people would find it so interesting that they'd start fiddling with it and execute themselves and, electrocute themselves. So, some of these texts deal with these novel technologies and how to actually manage them. Another one that I focused on was cholera, and you saw a little bit of that here. Obviously, there were countless pandemics from, throughout this period, and China was really devastated. And, in that chapter, I really tried to look at, the merging, the contestation, biomedicine, and, traditional medicine, and how people were, first of all, understanding the disease. Like, was this Huaguan? Was this the same as this ancient gastric disease, or was this a new biomedical disease? And trying to understand what a germ is, et cetera. So, again, you've got a clear outcome. You want to prevent getting the illness, and you want to cure those who have it. And then I looked at the question of how to graft the plant, because there was a certain focus on in many of these materials. And again, going back to actually a very early chain text, which was much of it was repeated in these later materials up through the 1950s. But then new elements added in, like, you have to seal the graft in a certain way by the 1940s so that, germs don't get in. But at the same time, you've got this one method of, using the grafter's own saliva to take the twig, use his or her own saliva, because that would transmit the qi, so there was like this cosmic connection of qi that would help the graft. So that was another, problem with the clear outcome. You want the plant to graft. So those were the kinds of issues I dealt with. And then your second question, sorry, I'm not writing things down, so I'm losing them. Yeah, not a lot of spiritual. I think that would be in different texts. These were all very much, focused on, just really the mundane doing of things, and not really sanctifying spaces or the activities that these people were doing. I'm sure it's there in the ether around these, but it's not specified in the text. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your talk. Really interested. I was reading your earlier work on Chinese women, and I suddenly noticed your talk. So I'm very happy to have this opportunity to listen to you in person. That period from 1894 to 1954, that's a very interesting period. It's a transition from the late Qing and to early Republican period. That's a fascinating period. And I look at the link and the Chicago University Press, and their description mentioned you call that a long Republic.
The Long Republic.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. I understand the 1954 because, the China was still, was not was not occupied by the POA until earlier 50s. But can you explain to me, why you think in 1894 is qualify as a Republican period? Yeah.
Yeah, so I think of it as a cultural formation, not really a political formation. So it is confusing because I'm not trying to say it was a republic from 1894, but I'm trying to say that what we think of as the republic as a cultural formation and what changed in the republic really started well before 1911 and, continued to live on until 1954. And the very specific way that I sort of demarcate these two bookends of this period is 1894, obviously new knowledge had been coming in, from the time of the Opium Wars and actually before that in other ways. But really 1894, I think, is a moment when there's a real realization on the part of these more Minjian kinds of publishers that the knowledge system is different. And a specific example, the Wanbao Tuanshu, this particular kind of daily use encyclopedia had been published from the Ming Dynasty, published all through the Qing with changes, internal changes, changes in the number of yuan. You get to 1894 and they add supplements to the end of the text. And these supplements include things like how to recognize a foreign coin, how to know when it's counterfeit, how to recognize a foreign flag, together with other things that are, more linked to traditional knowledge. But I sort of read that as the existing knowledge structure could no longer hold. And these commercial publishers recognized that the world around the common reader had fundamentally changed, and the common reader needed a new kind of information. And so there's a shift, and it's not just going on there. I mean, there are many other things going on. Obviously, this is Sino-Japanese War. There are real shifts in education, in translations that are done. Even like in the field of botany, you start to actually have it, taught at a more a lower level than it had been in the past and understood. So I see it as sort of an epistemic shift at that time. That these new kinds of knowledge really have to be a bit more systematically textualized and conveyed to common readers.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And another question is, a lot of these readers are for women, and you mentioned they're targeted to women. And also, considering you have written so much about, the gender issue in the Republic relation period, and how do you, in this book, and how do you deal with the, how this revolution? I remember you called that a mundane revolution of mundane, because I was there when you gave a talk in Oxford in that topic.
Oh,
Yeah, it was very good to see this book coming out. Yeah. And so how do you deal with the women issue in this book when you call the politics? And first I thought it was the gender politics, but probably it's not. Can you specify what?
So how gender figures in this book?
Right.
It's not a book about gender, but I feel that gender should be in all our books. And so, I have women in every chapter. As these knowers. So what I've done in this talk is sort of pulled from all the different chapters, the examples related to women, the book stalls and what they told us about women. As for this group of women versus women I've written about in the past, this is a different register of women. They're reading a different register of text if they're reading at all. So this is a different sphere than what I talked about with the women's journals or the women's textbooks. So it's a different demographic. But I've sort of just wanted to try and go deeper and deeper and see. Yeah. And there was another aspect of your question.
Would this cause any difference between? Would this change anything about the meaning of womanhood? When you consider this group of readers, Are they like a majority of, or they are more like grassroots, not the elite women?
They're not elite women, but you know, what I try to say here is that so for the elite woman, ways of constituting womanhood was learning proper deportment and learning, you know, the proper virtues, etc. And that is in the background here, but these women are constituting themselves as mothers, as caregivers, etc., through these, you know, these very sort of mundane acts. So it's a different way of, you know, it's a different subjectivity, it's a different way of expressing and manifesting and embodying woman. And we, not to say that elite women aren't doing similar things, but these women are not doing, these commoner women are not doing or not as preoccupied with the things that the elite women are.
Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to reading your book.
Thank you.
Do you have any other questions? Oh, yes, over here, please. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Judge, for your amazing presentation, always thought-provoking. I wanted to build on the previous question on womanhood, because I wanted to learn more about like the social impact that you probably have noticed when you're studying this woman, like the idea of womanhood and like the fact that these women were performing all these acts. Would you say that it actually reinforced the gender stereotypes of the time, or it actually opened up new possibilities for these common women? Thank you.
Okay, so I mean, in many ways, you know, these things are helping them to do the domestic things better. So these aren't texts that are telling them, you know, leave the countryside and get a job and become a new woman and start reading, you know, racy novels. This is, you know, sort of, so it's not, it's not a movement towards really different women's roles, if that's what you're getting at. It's ways of upgrading, you know, what a woman is expected to do in the household, but doing it better. So like the woman in the last example, she can now go to the Western pharmacy and she could, you know, from a newspaper, she could see that, you know, this particular kind of mixture was going to help her prevent infection and was going to help her. So in a way, yes, they are using new materials, but they're using them to reinforce the roles that they you know, have played traditionally. So I don't know if I'm answering you or if this is really doing the kind of work that you're thinking about. So you're wondering about social change.
Related to like the medicine and like when they were performing certain cures to cholera, but they also, like, was that like a starting point for them to explore, for example, a career in medicine later on? Did we see anything like that when you were doing your research?
No, but then again, you know, I haven't found anything like that. But, you know, it would make sense. That wasn't the kind of question I was focused on, but, you know, that's a really interesting thing to think about, and that what could take away from some of these materials. I mean, even the independent schools help to funnel these women towards middle school, and middle school to radically change a woman's life. But, you know, as I said, the overwhelming majority were, you know, being a housewife was still the main occupation of women, and it was transformed, but it was still the occupation of the housewife.
We're almost out of time, but maybe one.
There's one at the back.
I think so. Yeah, one final question.
Thank you for your talk. I have a question on your methodology. I remember you repeatedly mentioning like using common sense to sort of fill up the space that literal research is unobtainable. And I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit on that. Like, what are some common sense that you have filled in that really helped you get a certain example or lead to a certain insight?
Thank you. Excellent question. I was sort of emboldened when, because I kept trying, I would read these daily use materials and get a sense of, what somebody who would want to read it and how they would use it. And then I would read, something in a newspaper about, using a particular cure. So I'd sort of have all these pieces, a how-to that would tell you how to do an example of a person who did do it, but no one individual who left a record in order to say, I read this and then I did that, and this was the result. So I was sort of grappling with this, and then was doing a lot of reading in sort of early modern questions of commoner readership. And a number of people who worked in that area, there's a woman named Spafford, I can't remember her first name exactly, but these people came to the conclusion, we're going to hit a wall because we just don't have the materials that are going to elucidate this for us. And if we have done, so much of the groundwork to have, a critical mass of pieces, at some point we've got to say, somebody read this text and we know this person had this problem and this text addresses it. And it was available, where they lived, at the local miscellaneous bookstall or whatever. Then, let's put it together and sort of create a picture of who these common readers who have not been able to leave pictures of themselves for us. Let's do that. So I think it's probably the riskiest part of the book. It was, and I've, but I 190% stand behind it because otherwise, it's just a lot of dry numbers and, disparate data. And, I could be absolutely wrong. I could be, off the mark in some cases and close in others, but I just feel it helps push us a bit closer to understanding how these processes might unfold. Because we'll never know 100% that, Mrs. Lee actually, how, put that indelible stamp on her husband's thing. We won't know. But I think it helps us think about how these people manage the daily problems that they're faced with. And we'll see if it applies.
Yeah, thank you very much. All the more reason for us to look forward to the publication of your book and to reading your book, of course. So, given the time that we've unfortunately run out of time, but what remains for me to do is to please ask all of you to join me in thanking Professor Judge for taking the time to give us a talk.
Thank you all.
Yeah.
Thank you for inviting me and for such great questions.